Get ready to get nasty. Today we're going to discuss how to create villains that audiences will love to hate. By the way, my name is Brandon McNulty. I'm the author of Bad Parts, also the author of Entry Wounds, and welcome to my writing channel. One of my subscribers requested a video on how to make hateable villains, and I thought that was a great topic because we don't see very many hateable, disgusting villains anymore. They've kind of fallen out of fashion, and that's a shame because I believe they still hold a valuable place in storytelling. So we're going to talk about that today. I'll explain what a hateable villain is, why they work in certain stories, and I'm going to give you 5 tips for creating them. I'm also going to give you some examples from Game of Thrones, Rocky IV, and Titanic, so consider this your spoiler warning for those stories. But let's start off by talking about what a hateable villain is. And this is a villain who is the human embodiment of evil. And evil is of course open to interpretation, but these characters are typically very selfish people who represent humanity's worst qualities like greed, hatred, envy, revenge, and so on. And they display horrendously immoral behavior. They create unnecessary harm, they know exactly what they're doing, they have no good reason for it, and on top of it all, they take smug satisfaction in making other people suffer. And these types of villains, they're generally unlikable, they have no real redeeming qualities, and this is important to keep in mind. A lot of people would say, well, isn't the Joker from The Dark Knight, wouldn't he be considered a hateable villain? And I would say no, because the Joker, he's charismatic, he's intelligent, he's fascinating. There are reasons why we like him. We're excited when he's in a scene. But when we're talking about hateable villains, we're talking about villains that we're disgusted by, we hate them, we want them gone. Another thing to keep in mind with these types of villains, they often have an unfair advantage over the hero, and it may be because these villains have powerful friends, or maybe they have special weapons, or they're willing to lie, cheat, or harm innocent people in order to gain an advantage. And then one last thing to keep in mind with these villains, they typically lack humanizing backstory. Very rarely will the writers devote time to justifying the villain's actions or explaining why the villains are the way they are. Typically, you're just going to have a scenario where we see these villains doing horrible things and then the audience just hates them without feeling guilty about it. And that brings us to the topic of why hateable villains work. And the key reason why they work is because audiences love to root against them. Audiences want to see immoral behavior get punished. They want to see smug characters get kicked to the curb. And the thing is, when you really hate a villain, you're going to root for the hero even more. So it creates this powerful story dynamic where the audience is right behind the hero, they're rooting hard for the hero, and they're also rooting hard for the villain to fail. Another reason why these villains work is because unthinkably evil acts are exciting. And the thing is, audiences get gripped when the villain does something terrible because they want to see, how is the conflict going to get resolved? Is it going to get worse? Is that villain going to push the envelope even further? And these villains have a powerful impact on the story because they make the story world feel unsafe. They make it feel unpredictable. We don't know what they're capable of or how far they're willing to go, and because of that, we fear for the characters that we love. And then the last thing to keep in mind here is that certain stories benefit from having these hateable villains. Sometimes audiences want the simplicity of good versus evil. Sometimes they just want to see the hero crush evil like in Rocky IV, or escape evil like in Titanic. Or sometimes in a morally gray story like Game of Thrones, it helps to have a clear villain to hate, and that gives us a breather from all the moral complexity that's going on. Alright, now I'm going to give you 5 tips for creating hateable villains. And I'm also going to give you some examples from popular stories. We're going to take a look at Joffrey from Game of Thrones. He is, of course, the spoiled child who becomes king, and he rules Westeros in the early seasons of the show. We're going to also look at Ivan Drago from Rocky IV. He's the Russian supervillain who kills Apollo Creed and compels Rocky to get in the ring in order to avenge Apollo's death. And then finally, we're going to take a look at Cal Hockley from Titanic. He's Rose's fiance, he's the heir to a family fortune, and he's also a massive scumbag who looks down on everyone. Now, the first tip is to give your villain a kick the dog moment. You want to have them kill, maim, or intimidate a likable character or an innocent character. And the purpose of this is that you want to show that this villain is worth hating. Now, for example, Joffrey in the 2nd episode of Game of Thrones, he bullies the butcher's boy, and he cuts the kid's face. It's a completely unwarranted act. There's no reason for it other than the fact that Joffrey wants to establish control, he wants to mark his territory, he wants to give us a reason to hate him. Ivan Drago in Rocky IV, his kick the dog moment is when he brutally kills Apollo Creed and shows no remorse remorse after doing so. And then Cal Hockley, his kick the dog moment comes when he explodes at Rose after she challenges his authority. Second tip is to make your villain's behavior unforgivable. And this is where you want to dial up the selfishness to 11. You want your villain to have complete disregard for morals and politeness. You want the villain to cross unthinkable lines, break promises, commit betrayals, and so on. And we see this with Joffrey. He promises Sansa that he'll spare her father's life. Then Joffrey changes his mind and he has Ned executed. And then on top of this, Joffrey makes Sansa look at her father's severed head, and Joffrey takes pleasure in the act. And then after the Red Wedding in Season 3, Joffrey gleefully celebrates Robb Stark's death. He asks if they could get his head so that Joffrey can give it to Sansa as a wedding gift. It just doesn't get much worse than that. In Rocky IV, when Drago kills Apollo Creed, that's bad enough, but after the fight is over, he gets interviewed. They ask him, how does he feel about Apollo Creed? Does he hope he's okay? And then Drago says this:
If he dies, he dies.
The fact that Drago has no concern for Apollo's life or well-being gives us no choice but to hate the guy. And then Cal Hockley, he displays tons of horrendous behavior. Some of the highlights include when he tries to shoot Rose and Jack once they've reunited on the ship, and then later Cal abducts a child and pretends to be the kid's father in order to secure a spot on the lifeboat. Third tip, if you want to make a hateable villain, don't make them charismatic, charming, or funny. And if you do that, it'll be harder for the audience to hate the villain. You're better off making a villain who's menacing, disgusting, or corrupt. Joffrey, for instance, has no charisma. He's a spoiled brat, he throws tantrums, and he plays the victim when it suits him. And he can't even crack a good joke.
They say Stannis never smiles. I'll give him a red smile.
Drago, meanwhile, he's robotic in speech and demeanor. And then you have Cal Hockley, who's this smug, entitled, insufferable control freak. There's nothing to like here. Fourth tip, give the villain power they didn't earn. And this is important because typically we respect characters who work hard in order to achieve their goals or their position or their status or whatever it is. But if you want to create a hateful villain, make sure that they got lucky or they cheated in order to get where they are. And Joffrey is a great example of a character who doesn't earn anything. He's born a prince. He becomes a king due to circumstances. He never earns his kingship. He doesn't rally people around him or anything like that. He just happens to be alive when his so-called father dies. And another thing to keep in mind with Joffrey, usually when he wants something done, he has henchmen do it for him. Very rarely do you see Joffrey ever get his hands dirty or actually carry out his sadistic intentions. Usually he just asks somebody else to do it for him. Now with Ivan Drago, though he does train in order to become an athlete and train in order to get more powerful, he also cheats by using steroids, and he also benefits from all the latest technology. And this is something that is contrasted when we see Rocky training out in the wilderness, training out in the Russian tundra in order to fight Drago. And then with Cal Hockley, he's born into wealth, he's the heir to a Pittsburgh steel fortune, and even his marriage to Rose was arranged for him by Rose's mother. And then the fifth and final tip is to give your villain a comeuppance. And this is the satisfying punishment that the villain deserves. After all the horrible things they've done, they deserve payback. And audiences love seeing a villain get defeated or punished. I know I do. When I watched Game of Thrones and Joffrey got poisoned at his own wedding, I leaped off my couch and started clapping like a monkey. I was so thrilled. It was exactly what he deserved, an agonizing, unforeseen death after all the chaos and suffering he inflicted on the Stark family. And then with Ivan Drago, I get chills every time I see Rocky bust his face open in the second round. You have that he's cut moment, it's euphoric, and it works so well because the movie does such a great job of hyping up Drago as this menacing, invincible opponent. And then with Cal Hockley, he doesn't have an on-screen comeuppance, but we do learn of his fate in one of the final scenes from Titanic.
He married, of course, and inherited his millions. But the crash of '29 hit his interests hard, and he put a pistol in his mouth that year. Or so I read.
And this is, of course, a fitting comeuppance for a character who is so fixated on wealth, status, and control. Once he has those things taken away from him, he can't cope. But the key thing to keep in mind with the comeuppance, you want to give the audience a satisfying conclusion after all the pain and suffering the villain caused. So I hope this helps. Question of the day, what villain do you love to hate the most? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to support the channel, please pick up a copy of either one of my books and be sure to leave reviews on Amazon. Bad Parts is great if you like small town horror. It's about people trading away their sick and injured body parts in order to get healthy again. And then Entry Wounds is great if you like thrillers, and it's about a guy who picks up a haunted gun and he cannot put it down until he kills 6 people with it. Also, be sure to check out my other videos, like, share, and subscribe. And as always, remember to keep on writing.